Okay, a quick plug for you before we get started. If you happen to be a network engineer in the Boston area, I will be presenting on our WAN Manager Survey, which we're talking about on the show today, as well as some network pricing data that we have at the next event for the Massachusetts chapter of the U.S. Networking User Association. The event will be in Waltham, Massachusetts at the Painted Borough on Thursday, May 25th at 5 p.m. So if you're around, I hope to see you there. You can find more information at usnua.com. Welcome to Telegeography Explains the Internet, the show that explores the business behind all of the ways humans stay connected around the world. I'm your host, Greg Bryan, and my guest today is my colleague, May Harrison, who is going to help me go through results from our recently published WAN Manager Survey. We highlight key trends in multinational corporate networks around the world, like where they are with MPLS versus DIA and the underlay, SD-WAN adoption, cloud connectivity, a bit on even network as a service from the demand side, and many other topics. We have what we think, of course, is a great comprehensive review of what is afoot in the world of WANs. But before I get to the interview, I wanted to let all of you know that we will be taking a brief hiatus after this episode to put together the start of Season 5. Our producer, Jane Miller, and I have hatched a plan to sort of live up to the title of this podcast and take a few episodes at the start of the next season to pull back from specific, perhaps sometimes a bit esoteric topics and review some foundational concepts in telecoms. So we'll be talking about how does the internet really work? What do transport networks that support the internet look like? What really is the cloud and where is the cloud located? What is a WAN and why does it matter so much for corporations? So I'm really excited to tackle these core topics, and I look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks. Enjoy. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the WAN Manager Survey, and I had on my colleague, May Harrison, who wrote most of the chapter. So thanks for doing that, May, so that I didn't have to. But I thought we'd start out, introduce yourself perhaps, and then briefly, what is the WAN Manager Survey?
Sure, yeah. My name is May Harrison. I'm a junior analyst here at Telegeography. I work on the enterprise team with Greg. We make up the enterprise team.
Yes, as a matter of fact.
Yeah. And the WAN Manager Survey is our annual review of WAN managers' experiences and network configurations. People who look at, the design and sourcing and management of the wide area networks. And it's an annual survey. So we've started at 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the sixth year?
Fifth, yeah, something like that.
Fifth or sixth year that we've done it.
Yeah.
So this year we asked about things that we normally ask about, network configuration, but we also asked about some new things, SD-WAN, NaaS.
Yeah, absolutely. And why? What's the purpose? So, like, who is this for?
I think it varies a little bit for the average WAN manager. It's a resource for someone to see, what does a network configuration at a different multinational enterprise look like? What is the makeup of sort of the WAN market?
Mm-hmm.
But also we use it as our data inputs for our WAN
market sizing.
The WAN market sizing report. So it's, the data itself is used by us the rest of the year, but it also serves WAN managers, other people interested in telco in general. Yeah,
that's a good point. So it's the folks who take the survey want to see the results so that they can compare their strategy for IT infrastructure to other IT infrastructure managers at different multinationals around the world. But then, of course, the folks who sell WAN services want to know what WAN managers are thinking. And then we use, like you said, that input. I have a giant and very intimidating Excel file of assumptions for the Monte Carlo model that we do to make a market size based on this survey, basically. So it actually has a lot of purposes. And it also, I should note, goes into our SD-WAN research, goes into our cloud research. So it sort of peppers things throughout the rest of the telegeography areas too that deal with enterprise services. All right, so what we want to talk about on the show, May, is what we saw in 2022. So you put together all of the charts, and like I said before, kind of wrote this chapter. So I thought rather than just me speaking at people, as much as I do love the sound of my own voice, and I understand if you don't, but that's we're going to make you do this anyway. But rather than just me talk about it, I thought it'd be fun to ask you sort of what we found. So I thought really the key takeaway, the first key takeaway from this year was the mix of underlay services, MPLS, DIA, broadband. Can you tell us what we saw there in terms of MPLS usage and DIA usage, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think the biggest result that we saw, which was surprising to us, was that MPLS usage paused in its decline over the past 4 or 5 years. MPLS usage has generally declined in favor of DIA and broadband in terms of pricing and with the uptake of SD-WAN solutions. So rather than continuing to decline this year, we actually saw MPLS sort of flatten out.
Mm-hmm.
I think this year, DIA and MPLS were pretty close together, just about 3 percentage points away from each other,
right.
Which in past years, there's been a wider gap, and DIA has slowly been increasing. But now we're finally starting to see the two almost converge. Maybe DIA will overtake it one day, but I think we're just surprised in general that it, I was sort of expecting MPLS to continue on this like downward trend.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't seem like that's happening. It's really...
Yeah. And I would say that we also do interviews after the survey. So we get to talk to some people, not the full cohort of the survey, of course, but a small number of them about why they answered what they answered. And I think out of that, we probably found that, there's still plans to get rid of MPLS in a lot of cases. Just it's taking longer than people thought it would, sort of, to really switch over their networks. And I think there were some cases where they said they had switched to internet and it's just not good enough in some locations. So I think I did revise my forecast model a little bit based on this year that, I think the MPLS decline slowdown is due more in some cases to just it taking a long time post-COVID and everything for people to undertake big projects and go on to new contracts and whatnot. But so it will keep going down. But I also think there were quite a few cases where they said we just can't get rid of MPLS in some geographic locations, in some situations, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think geography is a big part of it, with certain parts of the world that are just going to run better on that higher cost product.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, there's also cases of companies wanting to keep like their large data centers on MPLS as a backup, maybe,
Mm-hmm.
To their internet. And I think we did have an interview with a WAN manager that was saying, they're with the uptake in SD-WAN and their implementation of it, MPLS is definitely becoming less necessary, but they don't want to get rid of it entirely.
Mm-hmm.
People are nervous to do that, and I think MPLS is great security-wise,
right.
So it makes sense to keep it somewhere
private, essentially. Yeah. So that So I think we're finding that the exuberance of like, oh, everything could be internet has tamped down a little bit. And while we see DIA still growing, broadband, I forget, broadband didn't quite grow this year, right? Or is it? It was, but it's still more in the mix than it was when I started asking about this in 2018.
Yeah, I think broadband did decrease a little bit,
Mhm.
like 23% last year to
Mhm.
about 14% this year,
Yeah, that's
which
big.
makes sense
Yeah.
as DIA is
Right.
increasing.
Yeah, and that's the other thing too, is that especially they're in locations where internet is difficult. If you are going to do internet, you would definitely do DIA, which
Yep.
comes with carrier grade SLAs and that kind of thing, right? So,
Yeah.
but even in urban places in the U.S., I think a lot of enterprises are looking more toward DIA than broadband. If you can get FiOS or Comcast or something giggy kind of broadband that's very reliable, that's a different story, perhaps. But
Yeah, definitely. I think broadband is more popular than, say, it was in 2018 when we started the survey, but it's also a great product for diverse access and backup, either if it's MPLS or DIA.
right, right, maybe even a tertiary connection, as we would call it. Yeah, absolutely. All right, how about bandwidth? So a story that I tell all the time, and it's nice when my stories can be rooted in actual data that we've collected here, but is that, okay, so yes, people didn't all go back to the office. We're in the office today, right? I think a lot of knowledge workers are doing what we're doing, like coming in once or twice a week, that kind of thing. But when they do, instead of being on the phone or whatever, or even having meetings in person, they're meeting over Zoom or actually, I'm seeing a lot more Teams than Zoom even these days. I don't know if that's a trend, but yeah. Those applications are very bandwidth hungry. So if you have a meeting that would have been in a meeting room, now that meeting includes at least several people who aren't in the office. And so we expected definitely to see some increase in bandwidth demand. Did we?
Yes.
That's good.
As you know, as maybe everyone listening doesn't yet, but with, the increase in remote connectivity post-pandemic and the uptake in SD-WAN, port sizes themselves have started to shrink on the MPLS side just because large MPLS ports are very expensive, and DIA ports of the same size are cheaper and provide just as good connectivity.
Right.
But yeah, we have seen pretty substantial growth in terms of bandwidth. DIA peaks at our top 4 bandwidth ranges. MPLS is still there, but it has decreased over the past few years significantly, where now we're really not seeing MPLS ports at those gigantic, gigi plus sizes.
No, that's a really interesting point. I think that's a worthwhile takeaway to put a pin in that. While MPLS usage didn't decline that much, it looks like some amount of demand still contracted in that the MPLS ports were smaller. So if you kept MPLS, it was at sites with that needed smaller ports, or if it was at the same site, it would be you would add a big DIA circuit and make your MPLS smaller. So there was some pullback of MPLS usage, perhaps hidden in the bandwidth distribution.
Yeah.
Even if the number of sites running MPLS was pretty similar. How about broadband? I mean, I guess broadband's not as available. So if you're talking above 50 megs, DIA was the strongest, right?
Yes.
Particularly at like gig-E or something. What about broadband? How does it work into the mix at those higher ranges?
Broadband was pretty comparable to DIA in terms of where it peaked. There was some usage of smaller port sizes, below 50 megs, but it was pretty substantial in terms of 100 to 500. Nothing really at above a gig-E, which makes sense.
Yeah, again, you just don't have broadband there. Whereas DIA, there's some, it's probably not super common, but there's some 10 gig DIA ports out there and stuff like that.
But those mid-tier ranges are good for broadband. And we saw enough activity there.
Yeah, which tracks. I always talk to lay people about this, and it's confusing them because if you have Comcast or FiOS or something at home, you might get 500 megs. Now, of course, that's contended. You're not actually getting 500 megs and that sort of thing. So it's not the same as. But then if you relate that to MPLS, we still see like a lot of MPLS ports are like 20 to 50 megs basically, so that I think does say a lot about the cost and what people are using MPLS versus internet for and that sort of thing. All right, how about providers? So we did add something I think worth highlighting to the survey this year, which was we asked about specific providers used. We had previously asked questions about like what type of provider, like global, regional, that kind of thing. So first, what did we find in terms of who folks are buying MPLS from, and then what specific providers were sort of notable?
Yeah, so we asked the same question that we've asked in previous years, basically what describes like your MPLS sourcing strategy, whether that be a mix of global and regional providers, or just global providers, just regional providers. And overwhelmingly, almost 40% said they were using a mix of global and regional providers to source MPLS.
Right. So that was our plurality. That was the biggest single one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The next biggest was a single global provider, which doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, if you're going to go with that global, especially if you're getting like managed services and all that sort of thing. So yeah, that's but it's still not a huge group, which is interesting. So.
Yeah. But yeah, in terms of what we found by provider by name,
right, actual providers.
Yeah, which I think is interesting that we asked, because it really puts into perspective how these providers are doing globally. We found that AT&T was on top for MPLS, and also we'll get to it, but for DIA as well. Almost 30% said that they use AT&T, followed by BT and Verizon, slightly smaller.
Yeah.
And just like small note that someone might list AT&T, but you can have multiple MPLS providers.
You can pick, in fact, almost like a large majority selected more than one provider. And that's really common, like for a bunch of reasons, but like one thing we always get into in our interviews, like M&A activity. So like you inherit a company and you inherit their sites and they're already running somebody and that sort of thing. So there's that factor. And there's the, sometimes people are looking for some kind of regional specific strength or whatever. But what is interesting to me about this one is that like AT&T, BT, and Verizon, right? It's like you could have just guessed that, perhaps, that like, the largest providers in the world are in fact the most used providers in the world. And we included, I don't know what, like maybe 24 options, to select. And most of them were selected by at least one or two folks, but many of them only had one or two respondents using them. So there's this long tail, I guess, but there's a pretty strong majority that are using. I guess if you threw Orange business in there as well, I almost said it the French way because I'm so used to thinking it that way in my head. Orange. So if you use Orange, if you threw Orange in there as well, then you'd have like almost everyone is using one of those four providers, basically, right? So
yeah, I mean, especially because I think the majority, over 80% of our participants had headquarters in the US or Western Europe or Canada. Right. So having one of those big three providers was almost necessary to connect to a lot of the places around here.
Yeah. But we did see, people selecting, regional providers in LATAM, APAC, that kind of thing. So it's out there certainly. And I should also say we didn't talk about the cohort really here, but most of our respondents, most of the enterprises that make it into telegeography's universe, right, are pretty large multinationals, right? So if we were talking to smaller companies, I suspect the answer would be possibly fairly different. Although we did do another survey last year that we outsourced and had a kind of broader net with that, and AT&T still won that one too. So AT&T is up there. All right, so we asked the same questions about DIA. How different was it?
Not very different.
Which is really interesting because that's one of the things about SD-WAN is it frees up your underlay options or whatever, but it looks like what we found in DIA for sourcing strategy and actual carriers use was pretty similar, right? So like
Yeah, almost. I mean, AT&T once again topped about a third of respondents, followed by Lumen, BT, and Verizon again.
Well, Lumen is interesting there. That it seems maybe Lumen's a little stronger in the DIA market than the MPLS market, perhaps.
Yeah, maybe.
At least among our Lumen might also target more mid-market enterprises than the AT&T, BT's, Verizon's do, or they also target them. But our cohort is again like mostly very large multinationals. So.
Right. Yeah, and we also saw with our DIA providers and also with the MPLS providers, we had a good handful of enterprises choosing one of the 3 Chinese triopoly state-run.
That's a really interesting finding. So, like, why? Why do you think?
I mean, it's because those are the only
I guess
state-run telcos you can get in China.
Ultimately, like if you have sites in China and you want DIA, you can. Whereas I think with MPLS, and that's why we heard a lot of folks mention that for China, that's where if they were replacing MPLS throughout their entire global network, they were still keeping it in China.
Yes,
because it's the way that the Chinese market works. I need to get an analyst who covers Asia because I don't know the story well enough but other providers I think can more easily offer MPLS. It's still through NNIs with those providers and whatnot in China, but DIA, I think in many cases you really have to get from one of the Chinese providers, and that was interesting that it showed up in our results here.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. And from the enterprises that we talked to, if they have sites in China, you really don't have another choice. If you want to be in China, you need to connect to China Telecom, China Unicom. Right. The third one is China Mobile.
Yeah, which is confusing because it's China Mobile, but China Mobile also sells wireline WAN services. So, well, and regionally too. I don't want to speak out of turn because I really need to get an Asia analyst. If we ever, maybe we'll do an episode on a deep dive on the Chinese telecom market. That sounds fun. All right. So then broadband, we didn't ask for specific ISPs, kind of thinking there's just so many ISPs in the world. Although now I'm looking at the results, I wonder if maybe we should ask for providers next year because we didn't find that a lot of people go directly to ISPs, did we? Or did we? How did that turn out?
Yeah. So we found that about 56% were directly from carriers.
Gotcha. So even if your broadband ultimately comes from a smaller ISP or whatever, you're buying it through your carrier because you don't want to mess with that, right? So
for at least a little over half, and then we had another 44% saying that they're getting direct from an ISP.
Yeah, so that's a fair number, so that's pretty big.
Still, although I am curious, maybe next year we get a little bit more specific. If they're sourcing from a carrier, who's the carrier, and if it lines up with their MPLS DIA.
Yeah, that would be my guess, right? Just what we see in the DIA would be, if I go to especially one of the big 4 or 5 carriers, and just say give me a WAN, then they're just sourcing everything for that WAN, even if I want to include internet. So it certainly seems like a big undertaking to go. And although we did interviews with people who say that they call ISPs all over the world, right? Yep. So that does happen, certainly. Yeah. And how about what kinds of internet providers? What did we find there?
Type of
as in cable, like Comcast, Spectrum, that kind of thing versus ISPs or whatever. So.
Yeah, it's a pretty. Cable providers themselves was about 15% of our respondents, and then MSPs about 7%. Mm-hmm. And then we did have a good chunk of people noting that they used aggregators as well, which I thought was interesting.
Right.
Because it's...
But only about 10%, right? Something like that?
Yeah, 10, 11%, yep.
Yeah, and what I find interesting about that is, so, there's some big name aggregators out there, well, and one that bought a bunch of the other big name aggregators, right? Yep. And ever since I first encountered that sort of whole business a long time ago, it seems like they do more still business with carriers than the enterprises directly. I mean, clearly we see some here, so that's it is definitely out there. But I think that a lot of enterprises are happy to just let someone else kind of figure out that ISP market for them, right?
Yep.
Which is why I thought we would see more aggregators, but I think even those aggregators are selling it to the carriers and then to the enterprise, I guess.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Interesting. All right. So then this year, we do every couple of years we look at some different topics. So like we switch between like security, SD-WAN, cloud, that sort of thing. So we looked this year at SD-WAN adoption and cloud. What did we find out for cloud? First off, what do we ask about for cloud? What are we looking for there?
We ask about infrastructure as a service providers, so cloud providers, and how many an enterprise is connected to, who they are. We also ask about data centers and point-to-point locations if an enterprise has noted that they use point-to-point.
Oh, right.
And then, data center locations. And the last thing this year that we added on was networking as a service uptake, and whether people have even heard of these solutions and if they're buying them or researching them.
Yeah, no, that's, I think we only asked like maybe one or two questions, but because it's a new thing. But it's interesting to see where people are with that. So, all right, so let's start with cloud providers, right? So we also ask for kind of market share, right? So what did we find for infrastructure as a service provider specifically? Because cloud providers could mean many things.
Sure.
So we're collecting data. We have to be specific. We asked about infrastructure as a service. Who's on top there?
Maybe not unsurprising to everybody, but Microsoft Azure came up on top with almost 100%.
Everybody,
almost everybody saying they used them.
I thought that was actually really interesting. As I recall, last time we asked that question a couple of years ago, Amazon was on top, so it looks like they kind of switched places.
I mean, I think AWS had or did they change their name? No,
I think it's still AWS. Okay. Yeah.
Had the first to market advantage.
Yeah, to some extent, for sure. Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are connected. I mean, keep in mind, this is, you can be connected to both.
Most of the vast majority of folks had selected both, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it is interesting that Azure overtook Amazon by so much.
Yeah, I found that interesting. I think maybe it has something to do with just the basic software suite, right?
Maybe,
it's like you have to use Excel,
why not buy there?
And then you just we'll use Outlook and Teams and all that. That's everybody, so that it may be also what folks are doing with their infrastructure as a service.
Yeah.
In other words, obviously, like Excel is not an infrastructure as a service product, but you're already in the ecosystem, as they say, right? So, how about Google or other sort of long tail people?
Sort of similar to Azure, Google has the same sort of, people are using Google Drive and Gmail, whatnot. Came out about a third of respondents using them.
Yeah, that's a pretty sizable chunk, because I've often associated Google with more mid-market or even smaller companies. But again, that we're talking to very large multinationals, that's still a fair chunk using Google. So that's yeah.
And then Oracle and IBM were our bottom two providers, 24%, 10%. And Oracle increased almost double, but IBM saw, a couple percentage points decrease, which is interesting just to see any decrease, I guess, in the cloud world.
Yeah.
Because you would think it would continue
No, and we also heard, again, this was a minority in the interviews, but we did hear some people that were like, we've pulled back on our cloud strategy a little bit and moving back to some on-prem data centers and that sort of thing. So there's some people who went too far into the cloud world, perhaps. So
a little too quickly.
Yeah, exactly. So now you're learning what really belonged there and what didn't. So.
Well, yeah, and just jumping ahead a little bit, we did have our respondents, almost a fifth of WAN managers saying that they did have some mix of on-prem connectivity.
Right. So we asked about data center locations, and we found that a lot actually do have on-premise data centers still, right? So, and that increased, it looks like.
Yeah,
right?
It did increase.
Well, for all, so we had what, like 10, like you went from like 1 in 10 to 1 in 5 that had all of their data on-prem, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yep.
that's really huge to me. I think that's really interesting. So
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, the whole cloud world is constantly changing and really dependent on market changes.
right.
But yeah, this year was definitely interesting.
Still, worth pointing out that, of course, that means that like 80 some percent
Sure.
or whatever have some mix of off-prem, on-prem, neutral facilities, that whatever. So it is still a small minority, but that's interesting that that minority grew in the last 2 years, basically. So
Yeah, I think our biggest category was a mix of basically everything.
Right.
Which makes sense for these gigantic multinational enterprises.
Again, especially the M&A ones,
Yep.
and that's end up with lots of data centers.
People who have like their legacy networks and are trying to bring things on, keep some things on-prem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So we asked about something kind of new, although it depends on who you ask and how new this is and what it means. But network as a service. I've done a few episodes of network as a service, so I won't make you define it for us,
okay.
because the way that we were being very general about it in the survey too, just to see kind of where people were with it. But essentially, any kind of it's more in the way that we were phrasing the question about, like, the way that you purchase network service, like that, can you get like on demand bandwidth and stuff like that. So, and again, to be clear to everybody, that's almost always like between data centers or something like that, not to the offices. But I was kind of surprised at what we found here. How did we find that NaaS had been sort of accepted by the enterprise folks that we talked to?
Yeah. So the first kind of question is, like, what's your relationship to NaaS? Have you purchased it and are actively using it, or are you researching it, or have you never heard of what we're talking about?
Right.
And only 5% said that they had purchased and are actively using NaaS solutions, which
that is very small.
Very, very small.
Yeah. So there's a big opportunity.
Yeah.
Possibility.
I mean, on the other side of that, almost 40% were not familiar with the solutions, had never heard of them.
Right. So even bigger. So and there were some people who were like, oh yeah, it's on my radar, just haven't gotten around to it yet, kind of. But you had quite a few people who like hadn't even really started to look into it at all. So
yeah. And I think especially with the emergence of like SASE architectures and ZTNA things, I think the WAN world in general has been a little bit overwhelmed with all the new solutions.
There's a lot to do. Yeah, absolutely. And I think this came out of several of the interviews that we did, where it's like your day is spent putting out fires and making sure that everyone's apps are working and there's nothing wrong, and that leaves relatively little time to go and figure out new things out there in the world. Which is why it's important maybe to get out to conferences and listen to webinars, stuff like that, right?
Yep.
So yeah. All right. So kind of in a way, other than the network stuff, the big event I think in the survey was SD-WAN.
Yeah.
And everyone's wanted to talk about SD-WAN for the last 5 or 6 years, maybe even more than that at this point. So how is SD-WAN uptake going?
Uptake itself, I think, is still on an upward trend, but installation rates
right. So
really fallen.
That's worth highlighting the difference. So people are still very interested in getting SD-WAN,
yes,
but they have not completed that task, is what you're saying, basically.
Yes, I'm saying people have researched and decided they're going to do it, but are finding that the rollout times are a little bit longer than expected,
right?
Which has led to this year where we sort of expected to see a pretty major jump between 2020 was the last time we asked about SD-WAN, a big jump in installation rates, and we didn't see that big of a jump.
Right.
I think it's 4 percentage points increase.
Yeah, you know what's really interesting here? I just realized this recently. I do a forecast of all of this for our market size forecast, and I'm always pretty conservative with how quickly things will go and that sort of thing. And I looked when I forecasted from 2020, like the last time we asked about SD-WAN, to 2022, I got 47%.
I know.
In my forecast.
I noticed that when I was
my
going through.
forecast was exactly right, even though I was thinking I was being kind of like conservative and whatnot, you know. So, yeah.
Well, and so while only 40% or 47% are actually installed, we did see that 86% were in some sort of adoption
in the
stage.
next year or two, in fact, we'll probably update that number in 2 years, and we expect it to be more like 3/4 or something like that. So,
because while the installation rate didn't grow as much, the rate of like people who said that they were currently in process of rolling out, like
in a POC or a pilot or whatever,
and that same thing happened where we had fewer respondents saying they had never or they didn't consider it or weren't adopting it. Fewer saying they were researching. Most people were in sort of like rollout or have already installed.
Right. So they all know it's out there. They all want it. They just haven't gotten to it yet, basically. So
and we found that most of our survey takers said it took more than a year for SD-WAN to get deployed.
Right. And so that was, if you went back a few years ago and listen to what people were saying about SD-WAN, it's plug and play. It's so easy. It's, it's always this way with everything. Everything is harder to do once you actually have to go accomplish the thing. And so I think, and obviously people not being on site and all these kinds of problems over the past several years that were in supply chains, the chip shortage and those kinds of things.
Any M&A that happens.
Exactly. Yeah. So exactly. So it took longer than everybody seems to have expected. But over the next several years, my model has SD-WAN going to very, very high percentage of sites ultimately, because like you said, we only 5% said they weren't going to adopt SD-WAN. So it's like almost everybody will have it at a lot of sites, but it's going to take a while basically. So
yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, we also asked about vendors like we did for network stuff. What did we find there?
We found that most people are going direct to an SD-WAN vendor.
I found that really interesting. It was the opposite trend. This one was one where it was not what I thought. I thought we would see more sort of giving up and going through their carrier, and kind of went in the other direction. So
yeah, I'm curious about that too. I'm not sure if it was people were more enthralled by the SD-WAN vendor, marketing and how it's put out there. And I mean, some carriers do offer an SD-WAN add-on.
Right. Through various so the way that we set it up and set up the sort of questions is like, there's the Viptelas, HP, Aruba, those kinds of things, right? That you could go directly to them, or you could go to Verizon, AT&T, BT, et cetera, and get Viptela or Silver Peak or whatever through them. When SD-WAN was nascent a few years ago, I wasn't surprised to see a lot of people going directly to the SD-WAN vendors, but I kind of thought that they would go more in the direction of just single kind of throat to choke and all that sort of thing with a carrier. But we did do an interview where one of our respondents had done that, had gotten SD-WAN through their carrier and did not like it that way. He had very strong opinions about that.
Did not like that vendor.
And so would be going to vendor direct after they get rid of what they got, basically. So, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and we asked specifically, which SD-WAN vendors were people using. And unsurprisingly, Cisco Viptela specifically, and VMware topped our chart. And then Cisco, Meraki, HP, Aruba came after, which are all,
what you would expect, probably. Yeah.
No huge surprise there.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and to be clear, what we're asking there is even if you purchase your SD-WAN through your carrier or an MSP or whatever, you still know that it's Viptela or whatever. Yeah. So it's we weren't asking who you purchase it from, but just which technology you're using. So yeah, I think it's more than half were using either Viptela or VMware, basically, right? So yeah, that's kind of not surprising. And so there again, there's like a very long tail of SD-WAN providers. And again, I think if we were talking to a broader group of corporations here, rather than sort of focused more on the very large multinationals like we are, we might get some different answers. But the smaller SD-WAN vendors are going to be more attractive to the smaller enterprises, I would reckon, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, if you have a huge global scale, you probably want you're going to lean towards a huge company like Cisco, perhaps more likely. So yeah, and then what about multiple SD-WAN vendors? What did we find there? That always seemed to me that it would make a lot of sense to have a single SD-WAN vendor deployed, but that was not what we necessarily found for a lot of folks, right? So.
Yeah, a lot of folks said they were using two or more vendors, and I think that's largely one based on geography and
right.
the sort of, if you have a global network, there are just some places that certain vendors are going to be easier to access.
Right.
Yeah, although it's interesting because you would think with these, I don't know, with these large enterprises that they might, have a huge smattering of different providers. And that, I don't know, it's just the whole story that we got this year was just a little bit more, it was different than what I was expecting in general. But yeah, there was definitely a lot of people using more than one.
Yeah.
And for a lot of different reasons too.
Yeah, like M&A,
security, and
yeah, right. And sometimes we talked to enterprises that have kind of a regional network strategy in general. So it's like they go with one provider in LATAM and so that even made its way over into SD-WAN, which I was just kind of surprised to hear that. It wasn't what I expected. So, all right, how about management levels? I know that for our colleague Brianna, who runs the SD-WAN vendor research that we do, this is an important aspect because we collect prices there, and the prices differ based on your management level. What do enterprises, large multinationals, actually seem to want in terms of SD-WAN management?
Yeah, this year or last year, 2022, we found that our survey participants, the plurality of them were going with unmanaged services. So about 40%, and then following that, about 36% were co-managed plans. So that's when you are sort of working directly with your vendor,
right?
Where they take on maybe the 24/7 aspect, and you can change your underlay rules and
you can still set some policies and stuff like that. I was surprised by this one again too.
Yeah.
Again, like with going vendor direct, I expected more of the earlier adopters to be on the unmanaged end of things, and that now we have the longer tail of adopters that you see more co-management, but it's not what we found.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I mean, I think we talked to one WAN manager who said, I have a network team that is so small, we cannot keep up with all the needs. So going co-managed is really the only way to keep up the SD-WAN, globally. But I also think the makeup of our survey participants, it makes sense that a lot of them are unmanaged, just because, these are people who are sort of at the forefront of networking.
Yeah, they're bothering to answer a survey. And that's, it's one of the frustrating things about any kind of research is that you can't know who didn't respond.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's all in, and there is definitely, I can't tell you the degree because I can't know what I don't know, but there is some amount of self-selection here that the kind of people who follow what telegeography does and would bother responding to a survey, who would spend 20 minutes of their time filling out a survey in exchange for a beautiful telegeography wall map, for example, might be slightly different than the people who are, sort of not that interested in this or not, able to have the time and space to do that. So, but there's just nothing we can say about that. It's the nature of information. Right? So, even still, lots of interesting things I think this year that we found. So, what are we going to look at for 2023? So we're going to, and that's one reason I wanted to do this episode now, is we'll very shortly be sending out surveys to WAN managers. What are we going to ask them?
Yeah, so our 2023 WAN Manager Survey will have the same sort of backbone that our previous surveys have had, asking about network configuration and locations. But we're also doing an update to our network security section. We asked in 2021, so this will be 2 years.
Yeah.
So we're curious to sort of see where people are with network security, who they're getting security from, what services, or if they're, providing them themselves, working on just, basic firewalls,
right?
Or if they're starting to, look into firewall as a service, next gen firewall.
Right. Yeah. I mean, even SASE, it's now a sort of like cliche almost, right? I don't want to say there's nothing against SASE. It's just that it's like everyone has to talk about it or whatever. When we last asked these questions, it was brand new, and so most people hadn't really even thought about it or whatever. And we kind of lumped it in with zero trust. And I have to like separate those things out. There's some little differences to pick apart there, but it's gonna be really interesting to see whether that has kept a pace with sort of folks leaving behind MPLS, going with more internet. They have to change their security posture to some extent, but it was very unusual when we asked this 2 years ago that folks had sort of dived into the zero trust or SASE world. So we'll see how much more of them have now. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Pretty interesting.
All right. And if folks want to know more about all of this stuff, where can they go?
They can go to telegeography.com.
I figured that. Yeah.
The WAN Manager Survey is under our cloud and WAN infrastructure product.
Right. Okay. So if you're a subscriber, that's where you find it is under cloud and WAN, under the demand section, which makes enough sense. Or we blogged about this when we released the report a few weeks ago.
Three or four posts about our biggest findings and a little bit of a dive into, what does this mean? And, you can see some pretty charts there.
I was going to say that's, so blog.telegeography.com. If you're listening to us talk about numbers, it's kind of not as for me. I would rather go see the charts, I suppose.
Same.
So,
they can go look at the charts on the blog.
Yeah, or look at them while we're blathering at you about numbers, right?
Yeah, just pull them up.
There you go. So I should have said that at the top of the show. Oh well.
We can edit him.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear everything you found out this year. And it's giving me ideas before we send the new survey out, what I should tweak a little bit. So,
yeah. Thanks for having me, Greg.
Cool. All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening. Telegeography Explains the Internet comes from the experts here at Telegeography. It's edited and produced by Jane Miller, and it's hosted by me, Greg Bryan. And I also wrote that theme song you're listening to right now. To learn more about our data, jump over to telegeography.com, and we'll see you on the internet.